Today I'm going to show you exactly what to do when you start a new piece at the piano so that you can approach every piece with confidence and achieve quick results. I'm Dr. Kate Boyd. Welcome to my channel where I help you take your piano playing to the next level with a new video each week. So be sure to hit the subscribe button down below. Stick around to the end because I've got a few bonus tips for you. So let's get started. Last week I made a video that talked about 5 preliminary steps to take when starting a new piece. I encourage you to go back and watch that video if you haven't seen it already because it'll give you a solid foundation to build on at this stage. The 5 steps I outlined in that video were to sight read all the way through it, listen to several recordings of it with the score, identify the hardest spots, look for patterns, and analyze the piece. Once you've done this preliminary work, you'll be in great shape to actually sit down and learn the piece. Now you're ready to divide the piece into large sections. I recommend doing this based on the piece's structure. So for example, if a piece is in sonata allegro form, then divide it into exposition, development, and recap. And then within each of these sections, look for the places where the texture changes and there are different melodies. You can often tell the new section by looking for the way that the writing has changed and look for differences in the texture. Now that you have your piece divided into large sections, the next step is to identify musical gestures. A musical gesture is a grouping of notes that operate together as a small, coherent musical unit. In a way, a musical gesture mimics the concept of a physical gesture. If I do this with my arm, that's a physical gesture I'm making. And it feels like it would not be complete to have a partial gesture. Like, it's not really possible to do part of this physical gesture. That would involve just stopping my arm in the middle of it, and then it wouldn't even look like that gesture. You can think about it like this. If music is a language, then a piece of music is a story. Each section in the piece is an event in the story, and each phrase in the section is a sentence. Each musical gesture within the phrase is a word in the sentence, and each note in the musical gesture is a syllable of a word. If you're an actor learning a script for a play, you don't learn your script by memorizing one individual syllable at a time. You start off by getting an idea of what the whole play is about, and then what is happening in a given scene in the play. Then, when it comes time to learn your lines, you practice the words sentence by sentence. So at this stage, we need to find the words or musical gestures that make up each phrase. We want to find the notes that belong together. These are going to be the smallest units you'll practice because it really doesn't make sense to practice individual disembodied notes. That would be the equivalent of learning a script by rote, syllable by syllable. It's possible, but then it really wouldn't make sense, and it's also like so tedious. By now you've done your preliminary work, and you've divided your piece into sections, and you've figured out the musical gestures. Now it's time to drill. Drilling at the piano is the same exact thing that an athlete does when they drill a challenging physical skill. We repeat it correctly multiple times to help train the mind and the body what motions are required to produce the desired result. What you're going to do is work on one section of the piece at a time and drill each musical gesture. I always start from the last section and work backwards toward the beginning of the piece. There are 2 reasons to start from the end. First, a lot of the hardest stuff is actually toward the end of a piece. A composer usually doesn't start right out of the gate with all of the fireworks and hardest stuff. Second, if you start from the end of the piece will be the most familiar, and as you play the piece, you'll get more and more confident rather than less and less confident, and that is a game changer, especially in a performance. This is where you're going to want to do a certain number of predetermined repetitions. I've found that it works best to go in the range of 5 to 7 repetitions. The number I always use when I do reps is 6, but I've heard some people do more than that, and sometimes you can get away with a little bit less than that. But you'll know when you're getting it because your body will tell you. It's important that these repetitions are not error-ridden. You want to make sure you're playing the correct rhythms, fingerings, and notes as you do each repetition. Also, take note of the articulations and dynamics and make sure you're doing those as well. And if you get stuck on a spot, take a moment to really practice it. Don't just gloss over it. This is the time to really get everything correct and in place for your interpretation. If you can't do the segment hands together yet, then just do it hands separate and then combine the hands. So in other words, do 6 times with the right hand, 6 times with the left hand, and then slow it down and then do 6 times hands together. I write down each repetition in my practice journal here because I want to add one really important thing here, which is that you actually need just a moment, a second or two between each repetition in order for the brain to absorb it, because that's how the learning process works. You don't want to just repeat something over and over and over and over without a break in between, because the learning happens in those pauses. Therefore, having a practice notebook and writing down each repetition gives you, I find, just the right amount of space between the repetitions so that my brain can process it. So in other words, you don't want to just play something over and over and over like a little magpie or something. You don't want to be like, okay, that's my 5 times. No. Instead, go, and then 1, 2, right? So you go back and forth, and then that gives you enough time to process. By the way, I made a video on how to keep a practice journal. You can check it out by clicking on the card link on the screen here. Depending on how long your piece is and the amount of practice time you have, you very well might not get through the whole piece in one day. That's okay. Focus on drilling one section and continue working backwards through the piece, section by section. Then the next day, when you come back to practice, do the drilling again for the same exact sections you did the first day. Do the same 6 reps. You'll need to relearn that part that you learned the first day because it only went into your short-term memory during that first session. But that's okay too. You'll notice that it comes back much more quickly. As a result, you'll find that it takes less time, like maybe half as long, to do the same number of repetitions. And because it takes you less time to cover the same amount of material you did the previous day, this gives you time in your practice schedule to add another section or more sections to drill and continue working backwards through the piece. The third day, come back and start again by drilling the section you started out with the first day. What'll happen over time is that after drilling the same sections for several days in a row, you'll intuitively start to combine segments. So maybe instead of doing 3 or 4 lines at a time, you'll naturally just start combining them and adding lines to them going backwards, and it'll actually start to feel quite easy and intuitive. This strategy is called chunking. It's how the brain learns and retains information. Work your way backward through the piece, section by section, until the whole piece is basically learned. This way of practicing is effective because it gives you a set of tasks. It quantifies the amount of practice you need to do. You'll know when you're done for the day. And now I'm going to share my final step with you, which is actually a step that should be happening at the same time as the previous step, which was the drilling. From the very beginning, as you're working on this new piece, it is essential to choose your fingering and write it in as you learn the piece. So that's the step. Write in your fingering as you learn the piece. This is a step a lot of people neglect, and then that gets them in a lot of trouble later. Think about it like this. If you want to learn a new athletic skill, like how to reliably do a layup, you need to do it consistently and drill it. You don't approach it in a haphazard manner. You don't just chuck the ball over your shoulder once and then the next time try coming right up close to the basket, and then the third time use both hands. You figure out one way to do it, and then you do that way over and over and over and over, trying to refine your gestures until it's second nature. Fingering operates the exact same way. It's totally counterproductive to work on a passage and spend practice time on it without considering the fingering and figuring out how to make it consistent. Also, once you choose your fingering, you need to remind yourself to actually follow the fingering. It's totally fine to write in fingering and then change your mind. But then use the eraser on your pencil and change the fingering in your score so it's consistent with what you're doing. Now you might think to yourself, well, I know what fingering I'm doing, so I don't need to write it in. I totally understand that, and I don't write fingering over every single note. But I do write fingering in pretty often because when I'm doing something slowly, or if I want to start in the middle of a passage, I need to know what fingering to use in that spot without having to reverse engineer it by looking at the beginning of the passage and trying to figure it out. My own personal rule is that if I make a mistake more than once, I write in fingering. Now I know from my own experience that drilling like this really works. My most vivid example of this is when I was learning the piano part of Pierrot Lunaire by Arnold Schoenberg. It's really, really, really hard piano part, and it doesn't have any discernible patterns. It's 21 movements long, and it just didn't feel like my practice was sticking. At the time I was learning it, I was visiting my parents in Florida, and the weather was so beautiful, I just wanted to spend time outside. I didn't want to be spending all my time inside practicing. And so I got really, really efficient. I divided each of the short movements into very, very small segments, and I started drilling it like crazy. And it helped. It helped me learn a very difficult piece in a fraction of the time it would have taken if I had practiced through each movement over and over, because that's how the brain works best. It's chunking. That's what we want to use. We want to leverage that to our advantage. Okay, now that I've shared all of that with you, I have a few bonus tips for you today as well. My first bonus tip is that drilling can actually help with nerves. A lot of time, nervousness in a performance happens because there's a subconscious recognition deep down of something lacking in the preparation at a fundamental level. So having a methodical way of drilling where you're sure to work equally on the whole entire piece from the early stages can help later on when you're performing, because it generates a much higher sense of security. My second bonus tip is to practice out of tempo if you have to. It's perfectly okay at the beginning stages of learning a piece to do some out-of-tempo practicing as you figure out how to move your fingers from one note to another. It's the same thing with if you're practicing and you need to hesitate to find a jump for the first few times you repeat it, and then over time you learn to incorporate it into the rhythmic structure. My third bonus tip is set an intention to play musically from the very first time you play. Insist that you play musically. Don't let yourself get away with mechanical practicing. You will only be setting yourself up for disappointment later, because music making is not about learning the notes and then adding the expression. You need to be thinking about the expression from the very first time you play. I hope this video is helpful to you in figuring out how to approach a brand new piece. How do you normally start a new piece at the piano? Let me know in the comments below. Also, if you have any questions, please reach out to me. You can send me an email at kateboyd@thepianoprof.com. See you later, and happy practicing.